Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So have you ever wondered what some of the materials, some of the plants, some of the plant structures, or even what some of the pests that we deal with day in and day out when we're looking at our houseplants or our tropical plants look like a bit closer up? So what I did a couple of weeks back was buy one of these USB microscopes that you can plug into your phone and get to see things a bit more up close. For people that have been here for a while, they know I've got a background in sciences, so I used to love things like biology and looking through microscopes. This is nowhere near as a proper scientific microscope, and I was trying to find something better to film with, but it will do in a pinch, and I was able to get some amazing clips. And this is a weird video to be filming because I filmed all of the clips first. I've started editing, and halfway through editing I'm now coming back to do more filming to talk you through what I have filmed. It's really bizarre, but I'm going to make it work. A few things to bear in mind, however, is that this microscope, I got it thinking it was as high definition as possible. It isn't. It is good enough definition that we should be able to see a few things quite clearly on this video, but it does mean that the resolution, when you see the clips, it will be a square rather than the kind of long form that we're all used to on YouTube. I can't do anything to get around that, if that makes sense, but most of the videos are clear enough that we should be able to see some of these different elements, and I can talk you through at least what I'm aware of, and hopefully some of it might be quite interesting to a lot of people. So what I will say is the first section of the video is more looking at things like materials, so substrates that we might be using, and I was able to film it both dry and wet, especially so you can see some of the kind of adhesion that some of these materials have to water molecules. And then I was also looking at things like roots or even kind of general plant structures, which I thought might be quite interesting to look at under the microscope. And at the very end, I've got the bugs. So I'm warning you now. The pests are at the very end. I will also give you a warning before we start going into the pest for the people that don't want to see things up close. I was able to film a few of the pests that that I've got in my space. What I wasn't able to film, I was able to find close-up clips online, and I can talk you through what we're seeing on those clips. But hopefully this might be quite an interesting video for a few people. This is definitely one of the videos that if you really want to geek out about kind of plant processes or structures, all of these things, this is the one for you. But enough of me prattling on, let's dive into the first clip. So one of the first things that we're going to be looking at under the microscope is sphagnum moss. And what you can see here with the sphagnum moss is you can see some of the coloration on the actual moss itself, some of those red areas, some of the green areas, because you need to remember this is still a living material. And this is sphagnum moss from Soil Ninja, which is really cool. You might be able to see some of the more white tips, and you can see in this section of the video where you're getting kind of the leaf structures almost. That's what I would imagine they are. They look a bit like scales, but I would imagine those would be the leaf structures of the sphagnum moss itself. Obviously, throughout the whole video, you're going to see me trying to focus a bit as well. Hopefully, I was able to minimize that as much as possible, but it's really interesting here to see at the very tip that it's actually almost entirely clear, which I think is really, really cool. The next thing we're going to be looking at is Leca. So Leca is, what was it called? It is lightweight expanded clay aggregate, I think it is. It's the expanded clay pebbles, basically. But let's look at the dry form of it first. So in the dry form, you can see here what the surface looks like of the Leca as well. There's some white sections on there, which I'm not entirely sure what they were, but you could see some of the divots that were happening throughout that structure, and that's obviously what's going to hold on to the water. You can see there a bit of a heavy divot there. And then here you can see the leca itself wet. So you can see where the water is pooling into those pockets as well, which makes it a really good material to kind of absorb that moisture from the water reservoirs down below up into the actual plant roots where the leca is. So this is what makes the material quite interesting. The next material we're going to be looking at is perlite up close. And here you can see the perlite dry up close. And remember, perlite is kind of puffed volcanic rock. So think of it as volcanic rock popcorn. So you can see it almost looks like it could be fluffy clouds. And then if we're looking at the wet section now, and I think if I'm not mistaken with this bit now, you can see where the water just came in here. I kind of dropped a bit of water within the actual perlite itself, just so you can see how quick it is to absorb that water. You can see all of that fuzziness that was around the material itself has now become a lot smoother, because that's where all the water is kind of adhering to the material, those kind of pockets around the perlite. What we're going to be looking at now is pumice, and this is pumice from the coarse semi-hydro mix from Soil Ninja, so it's a bit of a larger chunks, but essentially this would work the same way within pumice that you would buy in a bag, or pumice that you might find in Leca itself. So let's look at that. So I specifically added this section straight after the perlite section because they look like very similar materials under the microscope, but you can see there's a slight difference. So this is almost like unrefined kind of marble, so it's got some pitting in it, but it wasn't quite as fluffy as you might get with the perlite. But you can still see again all of those grooves, all of those nooks and crannies where the water can kind of sit in and it can pull up from. And here is another version, or another view essentially, of the same material, and you can see again all the different divots and everything where that moisture and that liquid, when you're basically watering something that does have pumice in it, where it can sit. Now going into wet pumice, you can see here that it's looking a bit shinier and a bit glossier. It's because it's got that layer of water sitting around it as well. You can see some of those grooves are looking a bit softer now. That would be the reason the water is now there. Very interesting material coming up. This is now, and you can see that I've kind of bundled a lot of the stuff that's within Leca or Soil Ninja semi-hydro mix together basically. So this is zeolite now, and zeolite, remember, is that material that within Leca, I think it's a bluish color. This one, because it's coming in from the Soil Ninja coarse mix, the coarse semi-hydro mix, it's got a slight green tinge to it. And this was really interesting to look at under the microscope, because it almost looks a bit like, I don't know how to describe this. People that are into their crystals and maybe quartzes and things like that, when they get inclusions of other, I don't know what they're called, crystals or other minerals within the rocks. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So here you can see what the zeolite looks like. You can see that green tinge, and this is, remember, dry zeolite is what we're looking at first. So there's almost that white cast that we're seeing around it. Again, all of those lovely little divots and spaces for the water to kind of adhere to, and again, it helps with that capillary action. Remember, this is the material that does affect the pH to a certain point as well within the semi-hydro mixes. And now looking at it on a wet kind of version, you can see that the green is a lot more evident. There's less of that white. You can see that saturation of water around the rocky material, but you can also see those other inclusions. And another material from semi-hydro mixes, let's have a look at lava rock. Now, out of all of the materials, lava rocks I found had the biggest kind of divots and holes and things to be filled in with water. And if I'm not mistaken, what we're looking at here is the dry form. So you can see it's that kind of black rock that you get. And here you can really clearly see when it's got water, how those pockets have filled with that moisture. And that's how that capillary action happens when the water is pulled up from the reservoir up to the roots of the plant, essentially. And looking at another component now that people might add into soil mixes, this is one that's used a lot when it comes to seed starting. We're going to be looking at vermiculite, and something that a lot of people might not realize about vermiculite either, because neither vermiculite nor perlite specifically give you the impression that they're potentially made out of puffed up rocks. But vermiculite is also puffed up rocks, and it will become a lot more apparent when we're looking at it under the microscope. So if you're looking at it here, you can clearly see that essentially it almost is reminiscent of rocks that you might get, and you get some of those striations. You can see that one section there, one piece of it there, and it's quite interesting because this has also got the grooves, but it's got it in a more linear format. The way that it obviously expands is much more linear rather than it has some divots. You can see here, I think if I'm not mistaken, in this section, I have added in some water, or some water is just about to come in, and you might be able to see some of it that's moving around and floating around. It's within that water, and you can see those slightly more jagged edges have started to soften up because, again, that water is adhering to it. So coming into something that I didn't even think to necessarily look under the microscope, but one of the lovely people that follows me on Instagram kind of mentioned it. It's just like, why don't you take a tiny pipette of water that you might get in water reservoirs when you're doing semi-hydro mixes and see what that looks like under the microscope. This wasn't the best microscope to do this with. However, I was able to see a few things which I thought might be quite interesting to share. So let's have a look. So what you're seeing here is that water, and what you're seeing, that structure that's there within that water, is a piece of algae. I was actually surprised. I was expecting to find more microorganisms here. As I said, it probably is to do with the microscope, that I'm not looking at it through a fully scientific microscope, that I can go into much bigger or closer magnification essentially. But it's still quite cool to see that there is life, even within something that we just think is something that's holding water. This might freak out a few people, but I think it's quite cool. And this is another chunk of algae that we're seeing again within that water reservoir. This is one for all of my soil or DIY Aroid mix fanatics out there. Let's have a look at what this is based on my Aroid mix, but it would be quite similar. You just have different compositions for your own Aroid mixes. But let's have a look at what it looks like under the microscope. So here you can see the coco coir, those long fibers that you can see, which is something that we forget a lot of the times when we're using something like coco coir, is the fibers, the coconut fibers. And you can see there's some bits of perlite. You might be able to spot there's some horticultural charcoal. I can never say that word. But it is really cool to see all the different elements, and this is obviously the dry mix. We're now going to be seeing the wet mix, and you can see the difference here, how much moisture that coco coir has absorbed. You can still see those fibers of the coconut husk. You can see the perlite there that's also saturated. There's probably still some of that charcoal in there as well, but it's kind of mixed up with everything. Now we're getting into plant structures, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to start you off with the dreaded one that everybody hopes to never see on their plant. Let's have a look at the beginnings of root rot. So here you can see the tip of the root that has started to get some root rot. You can also see that lighter section of the root, which obviously does not have the root rot, but if left untended essentially, that can start moving up the root itself, which is a shame, and you can see it's kind of deteriorating at the tip. Here we can see a more healthy root, so it still has that growing tip at the very top. I'll see if I can find the scientific name and put it at the top, because I cannot remember what it's called now. This is why I was focusing on it, but you can see that the other elements that you see stuck on it is sphagnum moss. Now this was really interesting because when I was looking at the roots, sorry, there is a bug, I should have warned. There's a bug that I've never seen before. It kind of almost looks a bit like a ladybird. I don't know what that is. If there's any bug specialists out there that have seen this before, tell me what it is, because I thought it was quite cool. I've never seen this, and I could not see this with the naked eye. The green that you're seeing on some of these roots is algae, but also if these roots, and I think these roots might have been exposed to some light, they can photosynthesize at some points as well. Now looking at the aerial roots, and again you can see that's where the node is, you can see the aerial root there, and again you can see that growing tip. Sorry, there was some issues with focusing here, but it should come into focus. There you go. That is the growing tip of the aerial root itself, and you can see that these roots are very different to the soil roots that we were looking at just a moment ago. So they're a bit harder, you can see some flakiness that's happening on the roots. And again, here we can see some of the tips, but there's a very specific reason why I put this. This is what the roots would look like on a plant that's going to attach to a plank. Look at all those little fibers that are coming off the roots. That would be what would attach to the plank. And this is very different to what you might see growing in the moss in a moss pole. And here again, we're looking at a root, and this is a water root if I'm not mistaken. You can see the tip there, you can see different elements, you can see those structures, those hair-like structures that are still kind of part of the roots. And obviously when we're repotting, some of those might get damaged because there's only so much we can do to salvage it. The green that you're seeing on here is some sphagnum moss that was attached to it, possibly even some algae. But you can see all those little fibers that are getting caught up within those little root fibers as well. And you can see a tiny bit of moss there as well. But this is quite interesting because a lot of the times we're not always aware that that is there within that root. That when we are repotting or moving things around, those hair-like structures on the root are very difficult to keep intact. I don't know what that white little section is there on the stem. I did focus on it for some moment. It's definitely not a bug. It might be a chunk of perlite, but I'm not entirely sure. In this section now, we're going to look at what a node looks like. And this is a node not where the aerial roots are, but where the growing tip is going to form from the node, essentially. And you can already see, if we look at this just now, you can start to see that's where the node is, and there's the growing little tip, essentially. So you might be able to see in a moment when it focuses a bit better where that leaf is going to split and emerge from, that very, very top there. And you can see how it's coming out of the actual node itself. That there is a dried cataphyll. So the next couple of clips that we're going to be looking at are actually pubescence, and pubescence is those hair-like structures that grow on some of our house plants. This specifically is from the leaf and from the petiole, so what attaches the leaf to the stem of my Begonia seismorii. So the fuzzy begonia that I have that I kind of fondly call Chewy or Chewbacca. But this is really cool because the first thing we're going to be looking at is what it looks like on the leaf itself. So here you can see all those hair-like structures that are coming out from the midrib of the leaf specifically, and you can see those are kind of fibrous. They're not really hairs, they are growing actually out of the stem itself, or the midrib. Here you can see the same structures coming out of the petiole. So again, this is what's attaching the leaf to the actual stem itself. And it's really cool because they almost look like they're transparent here. And these ones specifically do almost look a bit white when they're not under the microscope. The ones we were looking at before under the leaf are slightly on the redder color. This is something I wasn't planning or didn't have plans to film because I didn't have anything in bloom at that time, or so I thought. But I was having the last day, basically it was the death of the bloom that only lasted for about a day, which was my fern leaf cactus bloom, which is very, very cool. I have got some pictures. I did do some pictures on my Instagram stories. I might be doing a review soon on this plant as well because it's so, so cool. But let's have a look at what a bloom looks like. So here you're going to be able to see a lot of that pollen that's already on the, I think this is off, so you can see where the anthers are, and you can see that a lot of that pollen has already been deposited there. This was a bloom that died off, obviously. I don't think it was self-fertile, but I thought it was quite interesting to see it up close and to see where all that pollen is within that bloom. And you know I couldn't do plant structures without looking at something that's variegated under the microscope, so let's just look at that. So here you can see a variegated part of the leaf essentially. So you can see the green sections, you can see the fully white sections, which means that all the layers have got no chlorophyll. Can you see that slightly hazy section on the left of the screen now in the middle? That is where at least one of the layers has got some chlorophyll, but maybe that top layer doesn't. So you can see that's why it looks a bit more muted. That's why it would look a bit more muted when you were looking at it and it's not under the microscope. But I thought it's quite interesting to see those different layers of variegation. Continuing on with the theme of variegation, let's look at blister variegation. And blister variegation is different from chimeric variegation, which we might see on, say, something like a Monstera or Monstera albo. This might be something that you see on the more silvery leaves. So I'm thinking, for instance, my Piper sylvaticum, which you wouldn't assume is variegation, but it is a type of variegation. And it's called blister variegation because there are pockets of air that are trapped between those layers of the leaf, and this will become really apparent when we look at it under the microscope. So here you can see that silveriness, and you might be able to see that puckering that's happening there with the white sections that are coming across as white under the microscope, but those are little blisters of air that are stuck between the layers of the actual leaf itself, which I thought was quite interesting to look at and see what it would look like under the microscope. I think I've got some more close-ups coming up just now. And again, here you can see a different version of that leaf, but here you might be able to see kind of more that dotting that's happening. And you can see that maybe it isn't truly white. There might be some silveriness and the microscope is picking it up there. But you can see here, maybe a bit clearer, those blisters of air. And that's what's giving it that silvery appearance. This is something truly special as well. And again, this is the backside of the Piper sylvaticum, but I have talked about this on a few of my videos, and this is Extrafloral Nectaries. And you'll see the two different forms specifically for the Pipers, because for most plants you would just see that clear liquid on the underside of the leaves. It almost looks a bit like droplets. The Pipers, I assume it might be most of the Pipers, but definitely the Piper sylvaticum, it tends to oxidize so it looks black. So you get that kind of almost white little crystals and black little crystals, so it looks like it's got salt and pepper underneath the leaves. Let's have a look at that just now. So here it might not be fully apparent at the moment. You can see those little black dots. That is Extrafloral Nectaries that have oxidized. You can see it there. There you can see a clear Extrafloral Nectary, so that would be what we see as white, which when it's not under the microscope. And you should start seeing in a moment some more versions of that look like black and shriveled up. Those are the black kind of oxidized Extrafloral Nectaries as well. So that's where you get the two colors, which I thought was kind of cool. And you can see some of the blister variegation is coming through on the bottom part of the leaf as well. You can see those divots there as well. But yeah, some Extrafloral Nectaries. Right, this is your warning. If you don't want to see bugs, stop watching now. For the people that do want to see bugs, there's a whole bunch of bugs that are coming up just now. So the first one I want to be looking at is, and I was really excited I was able to actually capture this. This was pain like you cannot believe to try to capture it, to put it under the microscope and for it to stay there for long enough. You might see me move it quite a bit for this specific one, and this is Springtails. So this I was able to find from a plant that I had just watered, and the Springtails came out in the water in the drip tray, so I was able to capture it then, but I don't think they spring around during the looking at it under the microscope, but these are Springtails. Let's have a look. So there you go, you can see what that springtail is. I think this is just on some random bit of leaf that was potentially dying, but I was able to kind of capture it. There's a little baby springtail there as well. Again, apologies about the focus, but these things do not stay in one place. And if you've ever seen springtails move around, you know that they are exceptionally active. They're very good caretakers, especially in soil, because they will essentially eat decaying matter. So I always find it quite useful to have them in some of my soil mixes. But yeah, you can see here how they're moving around, and you can imagine that happening in the actual soil level itself. And the ones that I hate the most, and the people that have been here for a while know what I'm just about to see. Let's have a look at some baby mealybugs. And this is This is how mealybugs get you, because under that white fluffy bit there might be multiple little baby mealybugs ready to pounce, not just the one that you think there might be. Let's have a look. So here you can see that kind of cottony structure. You can see one baby mealybug there that hasn't got its fluff just yet, but can you see all those other little legs and little things that are moving within that cottony structure? That is more baby mealybugs. Joy. But this is why some of these things can spread quite quickly, essentially. So you can see all those other baby mealybugs there. All the things that are brown under there are other potential mealybugs that are ready to emerge. This looked like one mealybug under non-microscopy, basically. Now, looking at this, and this is a clip that I have used previously, but I thought I'd use it again here. This is a mama mealybug and a baby mealybug. You might not be able to see the fluff so much, but I was able to get this colored enough, basically, in the way that I don't know how I was able to kind of light this, but you might be able to see some movement that's happening. I think this was on a leaf that was kind of pretty much already been chopped off, so I think they were slowly kind of struggling. Apologies for like the skankiness of the filming there, but you might be able to see some of those little legs moving around. These do move a bit slower. You can see I'm trying to poke it there, and you can see the little legs. So creepy. I still don't like mealybugs, but nightmare fuel here. But it's interesting to know how these things function, because it might kind of inform on how you would be dealing with them when you're trying to get them off your houseplants, essentially. And I think there's going to be another little close-up here of a more fluffy section. There you go, you can see more of a fluffy section there. And again, this is another clip that I've used prior, but it's the only one I could find, and it's really difficult to try to capture this type of pests. So this one was a dead one on the back of one of my leaves, and this is whitefly. I know a lot of people might not get whitefly, but this is quite interesting to look at what they look like. I think they look like little baby moths almost. So if you look at it here, this is essentially a whitefly coccus, or something that has kind of essentially passed away. So we're now coming into clips that I didn't film, but I was able to find videos of it so we can kind of talk through it. The next one is going to be on aphids. And with aphids, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but aphids are a kind of pests that basically suck out the sap of the plants as well. And the reason why it can be quite tricky to get rid of them, not necessarily with pest control, because a lot of the times they call upon the cavalry, and the cavalry when it comes to aphids is the ants, and I will show you now why. So here you can see a whole bunch of aphids. Look at the bottom part of that aphid that is pushing towards the sky. It will come up in just a second if I'm not mistaken, and there we go. Can you see that little globule that happened? That is a sugary syrup, which was what the ants are attracted to, so they protect aphids. And I did leave one of the worst ones for last, and most people know what's coming up. If you don't want to see it, I do not blame you. This will make most people twitch in the corners. Shall we have a look at some thrips? First clip is adult thrips, and I think there's actually one more pest after this if I'm not mistaken, actually, my bad. But yeah, so first clip is adult thrips, and the second one is more juvenile thrips. I wasn't able to find a clip of the actual juvenile emerging from the leaf itself, but this is part of the problem with thrips a lot of the times, is that their juveniles are kind of buried within the leaf itself. So even if you think you've got rid of all the adults, those juveniles will essentially emerge from the leaf, still causing damage. But let's have a look at some thrips. So here we go, the bane of everyone's existence when they get them. And you can see how they are. You can see that little point at the tail, which is what creates some of the damage potentially on the leaves. That's, I would imagine, where they wouldn't be able to inject their larvae into the leaves itself. And they do fly as well. They're not great flyers, but they do fly, which is why it makes it tricky to get rid of them when they're established. Now is the more juvenile form, and you can see the feathers here, a bit more feathers, the wings, a bit clearer here, but you can also see how it's sucking the juices. And we'll finish up with a clip that you might have seen on some of my review videos, because I have used this quite a bit for those specific sections. But let's have a look. And you keep seeing me look down because I've got this is the only way that I can film this. I've got my laptop down below so I can look at the same clips whilst I'm talking through it. And magic of editing, it will make sense hopefully, and it will look good. But let's look at some Spidermites. So here you can see the Spidermites in action. Essentially, they do all look like little small spiders. That's the web that you're seeing that they usually will cast across the leaves, and it's usually by that point, if you're seeing a lot of webbing, you've already got a pretty heavy infestation. You'll get better over the years. The more you kind of deal with Spidermites, the more you'll be able to kind of spot them early on before they get an awful lot of webbing, and they are easier to deal with. But you can see out of all of the pests that we've seen so far, this is the one that comes in droves. So there is an awful lot of them, basically, when they're there. Okay, so I'm going to spare a thought for future me, which is going to edit all these little baby clips together, and hopefully you've enjoyed and it's looked good. Let me know if you want more videos like this, if you've got any ideas of things that you might want me to look under the microscope and we can talk through them. But yeah. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you had a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.